Welcome to this episode of Law Pod. My name's Eva Richards. I'm a current law student here at Queen's University Belfast. And today I'm here with Professor Luke Moffat and PhD student Lydia Miller, and we're going to talk about open source research and what it means for the law. So welcome, Luke and Lydia. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe it would be good to start with some introductions. So Lydia, do you want to go first?
Hello everyone, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. My name is Lydia and I'm a third year PhD student at Queen's. My thesis is looking at the usefulness of open source investigations in documenting conflict-related environmental harm for the purposes of transitional justice, which is a bit of a mouthful. And I also manage the digital investigation lab here at the law school.
I'm Luke, I'm a professor here at Queen's, and I mostly do transitional justice, human rights and international humanitarian law. So I loosely coordinate the digital investigation lab here at Queen's.
So Lydia, I know that you've been tackling this and there are definitional questions as well as part of your PhD research, but we talk about open source research, information, intelligence, investigation. What do these terms mean? How does it actually work in practice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have just finished writing a big chapter on open source investigations, and this was one of my first headaches, was trying to find the right terminology that I wanted to use. And basically there are three main things that we want to bear in mind when we're talking about this area of research. So firstly, we've got this term which is called open source information. And what is that? At its most basic, this is any publicly available information. So it could be news articles, government records, social media posts, or satellite imagery. And basically, if you can access it without breaking any laws or hacking, that's open source information. And then there's OSINT, or open source intelligence, which I think most people will be familiar with. And this is where collection becomes purposeful. So, for example, the European Union and US intelligence agencies define it as collecting and analysing open sources to produce actionable intelligence. So the word intelligence is doing a lot of work here, and it is implying a structured requirement and an end goal. But then that's also where some researchers get a touch uncomfortable. OSINT sometimes carries a connotation with sort of CIA, MI6, KGB, and for academics and civil society investigators looking at, potential human rights violations, we get a little bit uncomfortable with being lumped together with intelligence agencies. But a third term has therefore emerged, which is called just open source investigations, and it's preferred by groups like Bellingcat. And they use that quite deliberately. It keeps the analytical rigour of OSINT, but keeps a distance from the work of state intelligence frameworks. And that's the term that I use in my thesis. So that would be, again, I know there are a lot of terms flying about here, so that would be open source investigations.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I always think when I'm trying to explain this to people of these kind of examples that we see in the world. And I remember the Bellingcat investigation where they were able to just find a whole series of Google reviews and link that to Christopher Kinahan. And that was all just out there in the real world. And all it needed was someone to kind of put it together with this other information that was already also out there. So then I guess a question for both of you, because I know you've interacted with all this stuff in different ways. How has this wealth of information helped or maybe even kind of hindered sometimes legal research, litigation in general, or international law?
Yeah, I think it's a specialist skill and expertise. And so it's been a pleasure watching Lydia and the investigation team sort of developing that knowledge and expertise and authority now on it. But I think for most people work in, international humanitarian law, transitional justice and human rights in conflict, it's something which you're not taught in law school, and so it's maybe difficult to access. And for victims of civil society, it's often stuff they don't have access to. So, we've got 130 armed conflicts going on around the world, and most people affected by those and most civil society organisations working on that don't have access to those tools to help verify their claims or to help support advocacy efforts. So there is an aspect of it, and it's more critical stance that it's very, global north, and those who are wealthy enough, universities or organisations that can do this. So I think it has value in terms of bringing those pieces together, like you said, Eva, but it can also shed new light on cases which thought were never possible. And so you think the shooting down of MH17 over Ukraine a number of years ago, the investigations around El Fasher and how it was attacked and sieged in Sudan have shed light that's never been done before. But at the same time, it also is subject to disinformation and contestation, that nothing's politically neutral. We've seen it recently in relation to Iran and the allegations that America and Israel struck a school that killed, over 170 students, children. And then it was being declared fake news. And then, groups like Bellingcat and BBC Verify and others trying to piece together and to show how it actually wasn't. But even that Amnesty's report, the picture they've shown of actually the mass graves, people are saying, well, this is AI generated. So we live in an age of disinformation. Everybody has tools to make fakes, and it's very difficult for anybody then to verify the truth.
Yeah, I know that we did some research last year and we were always kind of looking at the Berkeley Protocol. But what other things maybe exist to regulate that and mitigate some of those dangers? How do they work?
You're on the money. There are two frameworks which are worth knowing, which regulate and mitigate this field of open source investigations. And as you said, the most famous is the Berkeley Protocol. And that was authored by a whole host of really intelligent folks, one of them being Alexa Koenig, who works at Berkeley. And she is sort of mother of university digital investigation labs, which we'll maybe come on to later. But at Berkeley, they published jointly with the UN Human Rights Office the foundational international standard, which identifies and provides guidance on conducting open or online research of alleged violations of international criminal law, human rights law, and humanitarian law. And they've also released, maybe the last year or two, have released a version of that geared towards environmental crimes, which is an area that I'm very interested in. And so I work more directly with it. But then there's also another methodology which is really useful, and it was put together by the Global Legal Action Network, who here at Queen's we're very familiar with because we had the wonderful Dervla Minogue with us here for a while, and she set up the first open source clinic here at Queen's. So we're familiar with the work of GLAN, and they partnered with Bellingcat, and they had this unit called the Justice and Accountability Unit, which looked at open source investigations and the law. And they devised a methodology which is more practically focused on the specific challenge of courtroom admissibility. So most judges and practitioners are trained in traditional forms of evidence, so witness testimony, forensics, and documentary records. But open source evidence asks them to evaluate something fundamentally different, and that's a chain of digital inference, where an investigator has cross-referenced a social media post with satellite imagery, matched shadows to confirm a time of day, or identified a military unit from a vehicle number plate visible in a crowdsourced video. And even where the methodology is sound and it follows the Berkeley Protocol, what we were talking about, courts have historically been sceptical, and they've struggled to bring cases to fruition because judges said that historically, stories of survivors were not enough to meet the legal requirement to have cases proceed, which is part of what drove the development of open source techniques in the first place as corroborating evidence. But those techniques became the subject of suspicion, especially because it's, newfangled digital age Gen Z social media business. Progress is being made, but it's uneven. So again, Global Legal Action Network in February 2024 delivered training to 50 Ukrainian judges, prosecutors and defence lawyers on open source evidence methodology. And the feedback was that this knowledge could transform which cases they're able to bring forward. And this training included a session by an international criminal court judge who advised the legal community to grasp the nettle and harness open source evidence. But again, that framing, grasp the nettle, tells you something. And even within the international criminal law community, there is still resistance to these forms of evidence gathering.
Which seems so strange because I think especially in Ukraine, most people have camera videos of everything that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you highlight an issue there as well. What about folks at the receiving end of horrible international crimes and whatnot. But they don't have access to Wi-Fi, or they don't have a phone. But when Luke mentioned the Al-Fashir killings in Sudan, that was actually a really interesting case, because what was done there, I think it was the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, they used satellite imagery to identify groupings of what they ascertained to be bodies, and were able to, again, use the satellite imagery to identify bloodstains on the ground. But then we have another issue, because more amateur open source investigators were then posting on social media images of what they thought were, hundreds of bodies scattered around a well, but they weren't bodies at all. They were just cows gathering to drink water. So it's like a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. In the right hands, open source information and like investigations can be really useful and can evidence things that we otherwise wouldn't know about. But then those tools in the wrong hands, or in the hands of those that maybe haven't received the requisite training, or they aren't aware of the necessary methodological standards, they can make wrong assumptions. And saying that a grouping of cows is in fact a grouping of killed people, it discredits the whole thing, in my opinion. So we need to be really careful.
So in some ways, I'm sorry to ask this, because I think it probably already feels like quite a boring question to ask someone what impact AI has had on them. But do you think AI has maybe meaningfully changed the way we can use this information, or made it useful in some ways? I know you've recently written a book about AI and war.
Yes. I think it's been really good to see our lab and see how the students have proactively used AI, from like the training they got from Bellingcat to sort of break down, foreign written languages on signs, and help geolocate different sites. I think in terms of what we're dealing with in the broader conflict of dealing with AI is the speeding up of the way in which attacks are occurring. So, it's only been 3 weeks or so since the US and Israel started their illegal war against Iran, and we're seeing 15 to 20,000 strikes in that time, something which would have taken years beforehand. So it's a question of scale and how much open source and like just general investigators and accountability experts can actually deal with this, and AI is being used to then speed up, and it's because it's using the basic techniques that open source use, and it's using about object recognition and how to train data sets or had past data sets used to then help generate targets or probabilities. And the difficulty is for like somebody trying to investigate this externally from these militaries is how do you verify and know in places like Iran or Gaza, where the internet's shut off. There is no, as Lydia was saying, people on the ground uploading material. So it's a very dangerous time, both in terms of how violence is used and how AI is speeding that up, but also if we think about the law and sort of vindicating people's rights, there's very few mechanisms we can use for accountability. And this gets more exacerbated by militaries stopping the use of satellite imagery or delaying for 14 days. So like the Manab strike in Iran, Planet Labs has been taken offline for 2 weeks, so there's a time delay now, and people being able to use that to sort of verify strikes. And I think it does a real disservice to like the military who are working to protect civilians and meet their legal obligations, and how these weapons are almost being powered by AI, but also undermining professional militaries around the world, because they're putting too much power and influence with stuff that's being generated through probability, and that's very dangerous. So I think new tech is useful for justice and accountability, but as Lydia said, it's a double-edged sword. I think it's maybe also a poison chalice in relation to how we drink the sweet nectar of generative AI and probability predictiveness that sort of undermines our own cognitive ability. And so I think one thing which came out quite strongly with the lab this year and working with our wars has been really good at sort of verifying where strikes happened, but the difficulty of what is seen and what's unseen and what's recorded on the ground by who's there, that it only gives you like an aperture that's very limited, and it's very difficult then to prove this person or that was killed or who was injured and whose property that was. These bigger questions that for transitional justice mechanisms like reparations or like truth recovery or criminal trials, it's necessary to sort of evidence. So technology is it's a tool. It's how it's used and how it's limited by its makers that really shapes sort of justice process now. So I think it's a dangerous thing we have to be very careful of.
And, AI models can present like highly confident analyses of things. So, like, I don't know if any of you remember reading about the study where when AI is wrong, it sometimes doubles down on the fact it's wrong and is so confident in the fact that it's wrong that it can't admit to that. And that can happen here as well because, a human expert on, say, satellite imagery can carefully review the material very, very slowly and skeptically with the assumption that this perhaps might not be the thing that they're hoping it is, and they can continue questioning what it is they're seeing. But given the high rate of hallucinations amongst AI, we can't be certain that it will try to tell us what we want it to as opposed to what's actually there. And I know Air Wars, who we've worked with this year at the Digital Investigation Lab, don't use AI in their open source investigations. And they understand that it makes the process a lot more drawn out and slow. And using AI might expedite that process, but they want to make sure they have it exactly right. And at the end of the day, they can stand by their work and, there's a bit more accountability there. Whereas if AI was involved in that process, it just adds a whole new level of uncertainty if something is wrong.
I think also, I guess, it makes me think of, because there are these sort of autonomous weapons that are largely at this point AI controlled, and then there's sort of an AI investigating the harm we're taking humans out at every single level apart from the people who are killed and injured. So is there a kind of a legal reasoning for not using AI in that kind of investigation?
I think like with any sort of evidence, it has to stand up to certain standards, whether that's a criminal trial or civil or elsewhere. And so there has to be sufficient probity that you have to be able to verify the evidence that, just because there's a picture and perhaps it's AI generated, there has to be other evidence to support that. And so that's why it's almost like this handiwork craft of investigations that AI is maybe just a tool, but it doesn't take away from actually interviewing survivors, getting insider testimony from those who committed it, maybe radio intercepts. So there's all these places where evidence can be generated and got from. AI, I think the danger of it is muddying the waters and sort of undermining that, and so allowing to breed reasonable doubt in a criminal prosecution, where you could have AI generated material to sort of counter what a prosecution is trying to bring. So there's a danger in that. I think one aspect is it's the veracity of information that's being gathered. So if you do have like a drone gun on the material and then storing that data and then an algorithm analysing that data and having that being used, analysis being used to inform decisions, that's where there's no longer human in that chain of information gallery or analysis. And so there's risks there that data will drop off, or that the algorithm could be poisoned, or they'd hallucinate. And so like you might not get a full picture, you might get a skewed picture, which could then influence the human who's then using that information. Like this isn't just like some drone weapon system in Ukraine or whatever. Thinking about even like social media and about the issues around how algorithms are tailored to make it perhaps more addictive to younger people, to sort of tie into people's political views. There's ongoing cases about how social media was used to inflame tensions in Ethiopia and Myanmar and elsewhere. And so like there's tools that are so powerful, but it's also how we see the world and how our brains operate, that we like things that are visual and storied and even quick, that we don't do the hard cognitive work of thinking through problems anymore. And so there's a danger of like humans becoming lazy. And like I could talk about science fiction and like how that has been a recurrent theme about how we rely on technology and the technology then enslaves us.
There's actually quite a lot, as you get into that question, there's actually quite a lot there. Like, I don't actually know, and I don't think at this stage that AI can really help us with meeting those evidential standards that the likes of Berkeley Protocol and the Glan-Bellingcat methodology require. So those two protocols, the Berkeley Protocol and then the Glan-Bellingcat methodology, they have a gold standard approach, and the 5 key parts of that approach involve preserving everything immediately, documenting your process transparently, so that includes every search, every step you take, verifying content rigorously and independently of its sources, so triangulating all your various different types of information to make sure they all support each other, maintain strict independence and guard against bias, and ensure legal compliance, especially around privacy and data integrity. And I just don't see where, I mean, I think AI can probably get involved a bit in the, verification of content, you could argue. But again, nothing beats having a human set of eyes on something. And again, like, it makes it more real and understandable to a human judge if we can explain it and walk them through the process step by step, and we can stand by the information we're presenting to them. But if it's all done by AI, how do you do that? But maybe I'm naive and too idealistic.
Like for like criminal trials and evidence at courts, perhaps there is a difficulty in using AI, but I see like for other transitional justice approaches like archiving, truth recovery and particularly reparations, that having such large data, like in Ukraine they're talking 8 to 10 million claims, that it's a way of having a pattern of analysis to show actually this violence occurred in a certain way in a certain location, and so help reducing the evidential burden on the victims. They can say, well, I was in Bucha in this date in March 2022, that it just assists them and helps to gather, points of interest of evidence that could support a victim's claim. So I think, there's no such thing as artificial intelligence. It doesn't exist at the moment, but the algorithms can help collate and gather the data that can be used by humans, but they can never be trusted, and it always has to be verified because of the risks with it, with bias, with hallucinations, with poisoning. So I think it's still a tool. It has its uses, but I think we need better education and literacy on all of these things, and I think that's why at school it's really good that we have got different law and tech masters and modules, but also like a really keen team of students involved within the digital investigation lab who are almost like self-learning and teaching themselves with the basics for training and like support we give them. It's really exciting to see what they're doing with it.
So that actually probably brings me to the investigation lab. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the lab started, what kinds of projects it's been involved in, maybe even how it's evolved over, I know I've been involved for 2 years, you've been involved for 3, how it's evolved over that time.
Yeah, so in October 2023, the School of Law here at Queen's and the Global Legal Action Network launched a clinical law project in which a small group of postgraduate students were trained to conduct open source investigations with a focus on gathering evidence for GLAN's groundbreaking cases. And as you say, Eva, this was 3 years ago, and I was in the first year of my PhD, and that's when I saw the announcement to apply. And I instantly wanted to give it a go, see if I could get onto it. Up until that point, I didn't know much about open source investigations. I think the first time that I became aware of the term was after watching the Navalny documentary, which is on BBC iPlayer. And it followed investigators at Bellingcat using open source investigations to try and work out who poisoned Alexei Navalny. But back to the clinic, we had an application task. We were given a satellite image of airplanes, military aircraft on an airfield, and we had to geolocate it. And that was our task to get onto the clinic. And it was so fun, a little bit different. And it was a welcome break from just writing essays, which I think a lot of the students on the lab really like, just the separation between, having to do quite standard format essays and then doing something totally different like digital investigations. So yeah, the clinic, got onto the clinic. That was great. It was led by Dervlin Minogue, who is a lawyer at Global Legal Action Network. So initially we were going to conduct a supply chain research task tracing illegally mined gold. However, the launch of the clinic also coincided with October 7th, 2023, and that attack and Israel's full-scale assault on Gaza then. And as the bombardment of Gaza continued, questions began to be raised about the UK's complicity in providing military equipment to Israel, which were then being used to commit war crimes in Gaza. Consequently, GLAN launched judicial reviews against the UK, seeking to halt arms sales to Israel, and particularly components for F-35 jets, which were used in Gaza. And it was this case that work from the clinic sought to support. Over the next year, we worked to verify scores of attacks perpetrated by the IDF against civilians in Gaza, including the targeting and killing of civilians carrying white flags. And they were targeted by snipers, attacks on healthcare and humanitarian aid, just to name a couple. One case that listeners might have heard of that we wrote up for GLAN was the case of Hind Rajab. a 5-year-old girl who was fleeing Gaza City with her family as per an IDF evacuation order when the car she was travelling in was shelled by the IDF. And Hind was phoning the Red Crescent for help just before she was killed, and those phone calls were recorded by the Red Crescent. So we were involved in assessing all of that information and writing up a report on it. And that's actually, her case has been made into a movie as well, The Killing of Hind Rajab. Ultimately, the work we did for GLAN, it was used for a case against the UK government in the High Court, but it failed. But we had created this vast data set of geolocated incidents of potential war crimes in Gaza, which is pretty cool. And a year later, in June 2025, the clinical law project ended, but I had a strong desire to keep building on the skills, and Luke was really keen to keep the clinic up and running. So we renamed it the Digital Investigation Lab, and it started up officially in October 2025. And we have 17 wonderful postgraduate researchers from the law school, which marks a significant increase from the original clinic where we only had 5 postgrad students. And we have folks from all over the world in the lab, including people from Palestine, Canada, India, the south of Ireland and the UK, who have all come from really varied backgrounds with experience in social work, neuroscience, music and journalism, and of course law. And this year, the lab partnered with Air Wars with the task of geolocating historic Russian airstrikes across Syria, contributing to its civilian harm archive, which already contains more than 10,000 allegations of harm across multiple conflicts in the country. So yeah, having Air Wars as the lab's sole civil society partner has given our work a real sense of focus and direction. Rather than spreading our efforts thinly across multiple projects, we're able to dedicate a lot of time and energy to supporting one organisation in a meaningful way. And I think that the students have really enjoyed it. We've got really good feedback. And yeah, the lab was due to finish up in April this year, but people want to keep going over the summer. So we're going to do that, which is a positive sign. Yeah.
I think it's, I really enjoyed it last year, really enjoyed it this year. I think something that has made this year really kind of satisfying is you get quite a lot of little wins if you're working on one specific thing and you find it. There's a real endorphin rush. And I know last year we spent quite a lot of our time trying to find things that weren't there.
Yeah. I think this year has been great because we've had really obvious objectives and goals, and our research aims have been really obvious. And I think for anyone trying to come up with a project using open source investigations, it's really important to have in mind your end goal and what it is you want to achieve. And this task that Air Wars gave us is geolocating incident by incident strikes that have happened in Syria. And so every time you geolocate something, as you said, you have a mini win. You've got the endorphin rush. You think you're a bit of a genius until you do the next incident and you can't find the thing. Whereas, in the past, I remember we were doing a supply chain investigation tracing illegally mined gold from, was it Indonesia?
Oh, we tried briefly in Sudan and it was
impossible.
Yeah.
And those supply chain investigations are extremely difficult to do and involve expert level training. So normally it's investigative journalists working for The Guardian or The New York Times or The Washington Post who are really, really high level. As a student-led group, we didn't have the skills or resources to do that type of project. Whereas this project by Air Wars, we could actually make headway with it, which is very satisfying because also it makes students feel like they're contributing to something bigger than just their university degree, which I think is very valuable, especially when people are coming from, they're doing human rights law and perhaps they want to go on to work for NGOs. This type of work matters to them.
One of the things which the lab has really benefited from is the training that people like Nick Waters has given us from Bellingcat, and also been a source of advice, as well as our Wars team who've showed us all different types of methodologies and working in places like Syria and how to sort of problem solve things. My role is I'm not an OSINT expert. I sort of play about with the basic sort of tools. It's more about the added value that law can bring to some of these things. So investigators and journalists will come to me with, sometimes hundreds of videos and images, trying to understand, is this a sort of a pattern that you could say it's a war crime or crime against humanity? So I think there's a value in the naming and shaming in the short term that open source investigations can bring, that doesn't rely on criminal trials to wait years or decades for an outcome for. So it has sometimes short-term gains. Perhaps that also can lead to better protection of vulnerable populations in conflict by pointing out how violations are emerging, even an early warning system. But like even around El Fasher, we saw the warning signs developing for weeks and still, the international community didn't act. So it's another tool of advocacy. It's another way of using the law in a relevant way. But at the same time, it isn't something that's used by itself. There still needs to be political action, and there's still value in people respecting the law and enforcing the law, especially when it comes around to armed conflict, because otherwise we are just drowning in data of violations every single day, and nobody, not even algorithms, can be able to sort of process that and verify that. And so this is always the problem. We're always in a justice deficit in these situations. Despite having volumes, petabytes of data, we can't actually action it or use it to sort of change behaviour.
Which probably brings me to looking ahead. What do you think the future maybe looks like for open source investigations in the context of your work in international humanitarian law?
I'm a little bit concerned both about how much this period is going to last, given that there is security risks about how even open source information, like where planes are operating. So the US's stealth fighter, the F-35, somebody was able to track it on flight radar before they carried out strikes against Iran. So I think there's going to be a closing civic space for doing this sort of work. It's going to be more, militaries and, particular commercial actors who'll be able to exploit this. And it's also access to satellites that was sort of taken for granted for a while, and even GPS. It's going to be more of a contested space where, we're already seeing the past few years in Ukraine and the Baltic states of how GPS is being spoofed or being jammed. And I think it's going to become more difficult to be able to do this. At the same time, we've been talking to different civil society groups and other academic institutions about how we could better leverage open source information to help support reparations efforts or to better promote civilian casualty analysis after strikes, to help even directly engage militaries to say how they could be doing this better and how to complement more on the ground documentary efforts that are going on at the same time. So it's a fluid space, which there's opportunities there, but I see that we need to speak out against the dangers that this space that we're currently working in could evaporate quite quickly if countries start closing down satellite imagery, start closing down access to the internet, and also block any sort of other information gathering that can be done remotely.
And add to that, I think one of the key problems that I'm stuck with at the minute with my thesis as well is that how do we enable other people in different regions of the world to get involved in this open source work? Because as we said earlier, it's a field occupied largely by global north organisations, and we've got these university open source labs popping up, which are great, but again, they're located in the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, at the exclusion of folks that are most likely going to be affected by the human rights abuses that we want to be able to make visible. And again, that issue of people not having access to Wi-Fi, not having phones, how do we get them involved in accountability and justice for harms that they are facing? And so I think, alongside our normal open source work, I also think we need to invest in low tech and offline documentation capacity for at-risk communities before the crisis even occurs. So, teaching people how to record and preserve evidence and practices around the chain of custody. And even things like voice recordings, written logs, photographs, they're all really useful things that can support these more externally based open source investigations. But I'll have to give credit to the NGO Witness, who's doing this work in great fashion. So people are beginning to work on that, which is great. But as always, more needs to be done. But also, I think just language infrastructure, funding machine translation and human expertise, so that when communities do generate digital content, investigators can pick up on that and it's not invisible to them because they can't understand what's being said. And also, most importantly, I think it's challenging the assumption that the investigative gaze should always flow outward from well-resourced organisations. So the potential to silence already marginalised communities through open source investigations is a real risk. And one remedy is ensuring that communities themselves have some control over how evidence about them is gathered, how it's framed and how it's used. And that means building genuine partnerships with local civil society organisations, rather than just always extracting information from the digital environment and processing it elsewhere. So that's something that I'm actively thinking about because, we want these spaces to be as inclusive as possible to make the greatest number of people visible for accountability processes.
Amazing. So that's probably, unless there's anything you want to add, maybe about your own work in the future, or...
I'm trying to use open source techniques to investigate a murder from 103 years ago. So... in South Armagh, which is using contemporary maps, and the Ordnance Survey Northern Ireland has maps that go back 300-400 years, so going back 100 years and seeing the layout of an area and to be able to work out where 2 people were shot and where the perpetrators came from and where they escaped to, and trying to work out where they lived and why they were attacked there and where the reference points were. So that's a book project for next year.
Wow.
Yeah, this is not as cool as that, but I suppose we'll continue our work on the Digital Investigation Lab, and we'll be recruiting a new cohort in September, which is exciting, and we'll have to think about a project to do then. I also have to finish my thesis, which I will do, but I'd quite like to conduct my own investigation from scratch using open source information to document, again, the conflict-related environmental harm stuff that I'm interested in, and almost run a moot trial with it to test its probative potential. That's something that I will do in the future, which I think would be interesting and somewhat valuable.
Amazing. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you, Lydia, for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.